morning. My name is Micky Devitt. I'm an attorney and a consultant at the Center for Public Affairs Research. I'm here doing consulting on the 2020 Census outreach, and I've prepared some materials and an infographic about why the 2020 Census will not have a question about citizenship. We've prepared an infographic that's available on our website, but I also wanted to introduce people to the material and give some information about that and how it came about, as well as some tools for doing your community outreach. So today we're going to talk about the Supreme Court's decision about the 2020 Census citizenship question and why it will not be on this census, and actually what the court did and what's happened since that decision within the administration and out in the community. So what's important to realize is that even though the question will not be on the census, the controversy has already done a lot of damage to trust in the community, and I want to be able to give you some tools to restore that trust. So where did the citizenship question come from? Where did this controversy arise? Actually, the history of the citizenship question is that it has been on the census in years past, but it hasn't been asked of all residents on the once-a-decade census since about the 1950 census because of concerns exactly that it discouraged voluntary response. So since 1950, the question about citizenship was only asked on the long form, which was given out to 1/4 to 1/6 of the population in any given census year. And it was also asked on the American Community Survey, which is a rotating sample of about 2.6% of the population, and that happens each year. So in 2010, in fact, the census only used the short form, and so the census question, or the citizenship question, wasn't asked at all on that census, but it was still asked on the American Community Survey. Now, fast forward to 2017, President Trump appointed Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, and within days of taking office, he took steps to add a citizenship question back to the 2020 census to be asked of all citizens. The issue was that he didn't say why he was doing it, and that's where all of the litigation came out of. In fact, the secretary's director of policy admitted at trial that he didn't know why the secretary wanted to ask the question suddenly, but he saw it in his job to, quote, find the best rationale, quote. By December of 2017, the Secretary of Commerce had persuaded the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division to request citizenship information, supposedly to enforce the Voting Rights Act. What's interesting about this is that Secretary of Commerce is supposed to have a reason for taking an action like this. And when he didn't have one, he asked other departments to create a justification for it. He first asked the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice's Executive Office of Immigration Review if they wanted citizenship data and if they wanted that to be collected from the census. Neither showed any interest. But the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division finally caved and agreed to solicit the information so that the census could seek it. The question, once decided upon, was immediately the subject of lawsuit by several states and cities and other public entities and nonprofits, primarily on three bases. The first was that the question, they believed, was added to discriminate against Hispanic and non-citizen residents, which would violate the Equal Protection Clause. The second basis for challenging the question was that litigants believed that it unreasonably risked an undercount and therefore violated the Constitution's enumeration clause. The enumeration clause is the clause in the Constitution that requires a count of all residents in the United States every 10 years. The third basis for challenging the question was that it was added without following proper federal procedures. Now, there's a law called the Administrative Procedure Act that dictates that actions and decisions by agencies cannot be, quote, arbitrary and capricious, end quote, and requires that certain procedures be followed in order to guarantee good decision making. So the back end of that is that the APA provides for review by the courts to ensure that procedures were followed and that decisions were made in a reasonable manner. The federal trial courts in New York, California, and Maryland all three determined that the Secretary of Commerce had in fact violated federal law and procedure by adding the citizenship question. And all three blocked the Secretary of Commerce from asking the question on the 2020 census. So none of the courts believed that there was enough evidence to show that there was an intent to discriminate based on race or national origin. But the Maryland court decided that the decision was arbitrary and capricious in violation of the APA, and that it unreasonably risked an undercount and violated the enumeration clause of the Constitution. California was the same as Maryland. New York took a slightly different tack. The New York decision agreed that adding the question violated the APA as arbitrary and capricious, but the reason behind that was that the stated rationale, which is that the Department of Justice needed this information to enforce Voting Rights Act protections, was a pretext or was false or made up. And they decided that because the Secretary of Commerce had failed to articulate its reasons for taking this action, that the Administrative Procedures Act had been violated. Because you can't provide judicial review if you don't know the reason that a government action was taken. So these decisions all came down in early 2019, all three of the courts. But the Secretary of Commerce's deadline for beginning to print census materials was in July of the same year. So because an appeal would take too long, the Trump administration appealed the trial court's decisions directly to the Supreme Court. So what did the Supreme Court decide? So the Supreme Court disagreed with the trial courts, underlying trial courts in Maryland and California and New York, insofar as any of them had decided that the citizenship question itself violated the enumeration clause or was unlawfully arbitrary and capricious. Essentially, that the Secretary of Commerce could provide an adequate rationale or justification for the question. However, the Supreme Court was firm that agencies have to provide explanations for their actions so that the courts can evaluate the constitutionality and legality of decisions. So Supreme Court upheld the New York trial court because they agreed that the Secretary's only stated reason for adding a question about citizenship was, quote, contrived. Because that wasn't a real reason for collecting the information, the Supreme Court blocked the administration from asking the question and sent the case back to the Secretary so he could provide his genuine reason for his actions that the court could then review. So since the case went back to the Secretary, could the census still ask about citizenship? The answer is no. And here's why. So June 27th, Supreme Court had issued its decision regarding the citizenship question. July 1st was to be the Census Bureau's internal deadline for beginning to print materials in time for the census. So by July 2nd, the government had announced that the census questionnaires had in fact gone to print without the question. What got confusing is that on July 5th, the government in the trial court in Maryland told the judge that they were still evaluating all available options to include a citizenship question. Now, that created conflict between the Census Bureau, who's saying we're going forward without it, and the government saying we're still going to argue about it. Finally, July 11th, President Trump announced that the government was abandoning all of its efforts legally to add the question in 2020. So the census will only ask questions about individuals' names, housing arrangements, sex, age, race, ethnicity, and each individual's relationship to the householder. But because the question went back down to the trial courts and then ultimately to the Census Bureau to see if they could come up with the actual rationale and justify that, the census in 2030 could potentially have that question. But there's, at this point, no possible way for that to occur for the 2020 census. So if the question isn't being asked, why does it matter? and why would it have mattered? So expert analysis from the Census Bureau at trial had predicted that asking about citizenship would depress self-response rates for households with non-citizens by a minimum of 5.1%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but to put it in perspective, Nebraska has approximately 43,000 households with at least one non-citizen member. If response rates are depressed by that 5.1%, it risks 2,200 households being undercounted. Even a small decrease in response has a very big impact. So in Nebraska, for example, an undercount of just the non-citizen households at that 5.1% rate would impact over $114 million in federal funding over the course of 10 years. So federal funds are distributed based on census numbers and population data, and this impacts everything from school funding to addiction funding to disaster relief, Medicare, Medicaid. All of these use in some way or another population data. The second impact that it has is that government and private entities use census data for research and to provide services, to make decisions about where businesses are going to be located, to make decisions about urban planning, where schools are going to be, and that data needs to be as reliable as possible. If there are undercounts in certain communities where there are high numbers of non-citizen residents, that's going to decrease the service capacities in those areas. Thirdly, a drop in voluntary participation makes the census much more expensive, because if people do not voluntarily respond, census will send out workers to count them personally, go to door. All of that costs extra money if people are not voluntarily responding. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the census accuracy is critical because it's used to apportion political representation in Congress, the number of congressional districts that we have in Nebraska, but also for voting districts within the state. So if you depress turnout in certain communities, it will disadvantage those areas with large populations of non-citizens for voting purposes. So if the question isn't going to be asked, why are we here? Well, one problem is that conflicts and flip-flopping within the Trump administration caused a lot of confusion in the community about whether the question might still be asked or could still be added. This has been compounded by the fact that since June of 2019, the Trump administration has made efforts to collect citizenship data in other ways, including an executive order on July 11th directing the census to gather information from other federal sources and release it to the states with citizenship or with the census data. Now, this executive order has been challenged by advocacy groups, and they're trying to block it, but ongoing publicity of that fight has further muddied public understanding of the status of the citizenship question, as well as undermined trust in the Census Bureau as far as its intent for gathering that information. On top of the confusion caused by the administration's early response to the Supreme Court striking down the immigration question, its ongoing immigration raids have further undermined trust in the immigrant community, not only of the motives for collecting such information, but in the ability to dispel information, because non-citizens are at increased risk if they're opening their doors to government agents. Census Bureau has to be out in the community knocking door to door to get information if people do not voluntarily respond. But immigrants who take Know Your Rights trainings, for example, know not to voluntarily ask questions or open the doors to government agents without a warrant signed by a judge. This is a barrier to those Census Bureau workers trying to get in and get the information that they need. The result of all of this is that community organizations are reporting very high levels of distrust of the census itself among non-citizen residents. Residents are expressing concern that census responses could be shared or used against them. So how can we, as a community, restore trust in the census process in this environment of distrust of the government? Your role as a census partner is critical to this because people need to hear from their church, their librarian, public school teachers, or other trusted community voices that the census is safe and secure and important. You can help us restore confidence by dispelling misinformation and rebuilding trust within the immigrant community. Outreach to immigrant communities can tell people that the census will not be asking about their citizenship question and reassure them on that point. Secondly, to the extent possible, you can include information about response confidentiality to further engender trust in the process. Finally, I'm hoping to give you tools to help people identify census takers so that they are not afraid to open their door and answer questions from the Census Bureau because they're worried about other government agents. So confidentiality. You can go out and tell your community that federal law is protecting all of their responses. So the Department of Commerce can only use collected information to produce statistics, and they can only release that information in such a way that individual households and responses can't be identified. For example, they can release tables of aggregated information or census tract level data, but they can't release information that could possibly be tied to a particular respondent. Further, census responses cannot be shared with or used by law enforcement or other entities to determine public benefits. In order to assure that confidentiality, census personnel are under oath not to disclose responses. So they take a lifetime oath not to share any information that they get in the course of their work for the census. And disclosure is punishable by up to 5 years in prison with a $250,000 fine. The third way we can restore trust in the community is by helping people identify census employees and understand what they're doing in the community so they won't be uncomfortable talking with them. So the first thing you can do is tell to your community about the ways and reasons census takers are out in the neighborhood. If they see people out, they could be verifying addresses. They do this to make sure that new buildings or new addresses are being accounted for. They're doing that right now. Collecting census responses at homes that did not respond. So if you do not respond voluntarily by phone, online, or in writing, a census taker will come out to your home. But census takers will also be out in the community counting hard to reach populations like the homeless, in areas that they congregate, or in group quarters like college campuses or nursing homes. People may also see census workers in neighborhoods that are typically served by post office boxes because they will have to drop off physically census questionnaires at those locations. And finally, they may be out after census enumeration or during census enumeration because they'll be conducting quality checks. One thing you can do if people want to avoid having that door-to-door visit is you can encourage people to respond early. If non-citizen residents in your community are concerned about having that door knock, if they respond early online by phone or by mail, they won't get a visit at all. But if they do get a visit, you can help them understand how to verify that a census worker who comes to their door is in fact the census. But first of all census workers will have a U.S. Department of Commerce ID badge that will have their photo, have a watermark, and will have an expiration date. They'll also be carrying an official 2020 census bag and a laptop with the 2020 census logo that they will be using in that work. But if people are still concerned, Census Bureau can help them verify identity before anyone talks to them. The census toll-free number nationwide is 1-800-923-8282. And Nebraska's Regional Census Center is in Dallas. That number is 972-510-1800. So if people have someone at their door and they're not sure whether or not to answer questions, before they answer questions, they can verify the identity of that person. So my hope is that this has given you some information to help dispel confusion in your communities about the 2020 census and the citizenship question, and also give you tools to reach out to people and help ensure that trust is reestablished and that people feel comfortable answering the census so that everyone is counted in Nebraska. If you have any questions, you can email me at mickydevett@unomaha.edu or call the Center for Public Affairs Research at 402-554-2134. Thank you so much for listening.